The air in the small roadside bar felt heavy, carrying a mix of old leather, spilled beer, and faint tobacco smoke. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the wooden walls, and the low hum of conversation usually gave the place a relaxed, almost sleepy vibe. It was the kind of spot where truckers stopped to rest and locals gathered to swap stories. Most nights were uneventful. But not tonight. The peace had been broken by the arrival of a group of bikers. Their laughter was loud and sharp, cutting through the room like a chainsaw. Their boots thudded against the worn floorboards as they stomped to the bar, and their voices carried over the clink of beer bottles and the shuffle of chairs. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in leather vests and faded jeans. Tattoos snaked up their arms, and their faces bore the marks of years spent on the road, weathered, tough, and unapologetic. They owned the space with their presence, and most of the regulars seemed content to stay out of their way. In the corner, near the jukebox that hadn't worked in years, sat a lone woman. She was hunched over a glass of whiskey, her fingers lightly tracing the rim. Her clothes were simple worn jeans, a plain jacket, and a ball cap pulled low enough to cast a shadow over her face. She blended into the background so completely that it was easy to overlook her. And that's exactly what the bikers did. To them, she was just another quiet patron, another invisible figure in a room full of nobodies. But Emily Dawson was far from ordinary. Underneath her calm exterior, Emily carried a story that would have silenced even the rowdiest crowd. She wasn't just another passerby stopping for a drink. She was a soldier, fresh off a long and grueling deployment. She had spent years in some of the world's most hostile environments, facing challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. Her body bore the scars of battle, and her mind carried memories she'd rather forget. But none of that showed. To anyone looking her way, she was just another woman, unremarkable and easy to ignore. Her slight frame and relaxed posture gave no hint of the strength that lay beneath. She hadn't come to the bar seeking attention. In fact, she preferred the quiet anonymity of places like this. After months of intense training and high-stakes missions, the last thing she wanted was more conflict. All she needed was a moment to breathe, a drink to steady her nerves, and a corner to call her own. The bikers, however, had a way of pulling attention wherever they went. They slammed their glasses down on the bar, their voices booming with crude jokes and exaggerated tales of the road. The bartender, an older man with a thin frame and a kind face, did his best to keep up with their orders, though his hands trembled slightly as he poured their drinks. One of the bikers, a tall man with a shaggy beard and a booming voice, leaned against the bar and scanned the room. His eyes swept over Emily without stopping, moving on to the other patrons, a group of truckers playing cards, a young couple sharing a quiet conversation, and a man reading a newspaper in the far corner. Emily remained still, her eyes fixed on her glass. She could feel the weight of the room shifting, the uneasy energy that often came with men like these. She had seen it before, in other bars, other towns. They thrived on being the center of attention, on making people uncomfortable just because they could. The bartender tried to keep the peace, offering quick smiles and polite words, but the bikers didn't seem interested in playing nice. They laughed loudly, their voices growing bolder with each drink. Emily took a slow sip of her whiskey, savoring the warmth as it slid down her throat. She wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding her. Her mind wandered briefly to the past, to the days when she had been surrounded by her unit, each of them watching the others back. Out there, in the chaos of war, she had learned to read people in an instant, to spot the signs of danger before it arrived, to sense when a situation was about to turn. And tonight, her instincts were telling her that things were about to get messy. Still, she stayed calm, her movements deliberate and measured. She didn't flinch when one of the bikers slammed his fist on the bar, nor did she react when their laughter grew louder. She had faced far worse than this. But she couldn't help noticing the tension in the bartender's shoulders, the way his hands trembled just a little more each time he poured a drink. He was nervous, and for good reason. Emily's grip on her glass tightened slightly. She didn't want to get involved, not tonight, not here. But if things escalated, she knew she wouldn't be able to sit by and watch. For now, she waited, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her cap. She was patient, quiet, and observant, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd with ease. But Emily Dawson wasn't invisible. Not really. And before the night was over, everyone in the bar would know exactly who she was. Emily sat quietly, her fingers grazing the edge of her glass as she listened to the noise unfold around her. She didn't have to look up to know the bikers were already pushing boundaries. It was in their tone, the way their laughter seemed to grow sharper, aimed like a dagger at anyone who dared cross their line of sight. At the bar, the leader, a towering man with arms thick as tree trunks and a jagged scar cutting across his cheek, slapped the counter. "Another round, old man," he barked, his voice rough and commanding. The bartender, who had introduced himself earlier as Jack, nodded quickly and began pouring another set of drinks. Emily could see the subtle hesitation in his movements. He was trying to keep them happy, but she also knew what men like this did when they thought they owned a place. One of the bikers, a wiry man with wild hair and a chipped tooth, leaned against the bar and scanned the room. His eyes finally landed on Emily. He nudged the leader with an elbow. "Hey, Deke," he said, tilting his head in her direction. "Check out the little lady over there. All alone, just sitting there. Ain't she cute?" Deke glanced over, his lips curling into a predatory grin. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, pushing off the bar. "A little birdie trying to hide in the corner." Emily didn't react. She kept her gaze on her drink, letting the soft hum of her breath ground her. She'd been through this before, in places just like this, with men just like him. She knew how this game worked: let them bark, and they'd usually leave on their own. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. Deke took a step closer, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. The bar fell quieter, the other patrons stealing glances from behind their glasses. No one dared intervene, and Emily couldn't blame them. The bikers had the kind of energy that screamed danger. "Hey, sweetheart," Deke said, his voice dripping with false charm. "You lost or something? Don't see many ladies like you hanging out in places like this." Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. She considered ignoring him but knew that wouldn't stop him. These kinds of men thrived on attention, on forcing reactions from people. Slowly, she looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that betrayed none of the annoyance building inside her. "Just having a drink," she said evenly, her tone calm and measured. Deke chuckled, his grin widening. "Well, isn't that nice?" he said, pulling out a chair and plopping down across from her without invitation. "Mind if I join you? Looks like you could use some company." "I'm fine," Emily replied, her voice steady. The other bikers whistled and hollered from the bar, egging him on. "Go on, Deke," one of them called. "She's playing hard to get." Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had no interest in escalating the situation, but she also wasn't about to let herself be cornered. "Listen," Deke said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I'm just trying to be friendly. You don't have to act all cold." Emily met his gaze again, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "I said I'm fine." For a moment, there was silence. Deke's grin faltered, his expression shifting to something harder, meaner. "You know," he said, his tone darkening, "it's not polite to turn down hospitality." Emily leaned back slightly, her body language relaxed despite the rising tension. "And it's not polite to bother someone who wants to be left alone." The room seemed to hold its breath. The bartender froze mid-pour, his eyes darting between Deke and Emily. The other patrons exchanged nervous glances, their unease palpable. Deke let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You've got a mouth on you," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I like that." He turned toward his crew. "What do you think, boys? Should we teach this little lady some manners?" The bikers erupted in laughter, slapping the bar and hollering their agreement. Emily's eyes flicked toward the bartender, who looked like he was about to intervene but thought better of it. She couldn't blame him. He wasn't equipped to handle this kind of trouble, and stepping in would only put him in harm's way. She took a deep breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. She could defuse the situation with a few well-chosen words or end it quickly if things went south. Either way, she knew she had to stay calm. "Listen," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not looking for trouble. Why don't you go back to the bar and enjoy your drinks?" Dek's grin returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm enjoying myself just fine right here," he said. Emily sighed inwardly. Men like Deke only understood one thing: power. And while she wasn't eager to show her hand, she also wasn't about to let him walk all over her. The room had grown eerily quiet, the tension hanging thick in the air. Even the bikers seemed to sense that something was off, their laughter tapering into murmurs. Deke reached for her glass, as if testing her boundaries. "Mind if I?" Before he could finish, Emily's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising force. Her movements were quick and controlled, her grip firm but not aggressive. She didn't want to hurt him yet. "I said," she repeated, her voice low and commanding, "I'm not looking for trouble." Dek's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by her strength. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. Then his shock turned to anger. "Let go of me," he growled, his voice laced with menace. Emily released his wrist, her expression calm and unreadable. "Walk away," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Deke hesitated, his pride clearly wounded. He glanced back at his crew, who were watching with a mix of confusion and amusement. He couldn't back down now, not in front of them. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know who you think you are, but—" "That's enough," a voice interrupted. It was the bartender. Jack had stepped out from behind the counter, his hands trembling but his expression resolute. "Why don't you leave her alone and get back to your drinks?" he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Deke turned toward him, his face darkening. "And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" he sneered. Emily's jaw tightened. She could feel the tension in the room shifting, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. She couldn't let this go any further, not with innocent people involved. "Hey," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Deke turned back to her, his expression a mix of anger and curiosity. "You don't want to do this," she said, her tone calm but firm. He let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, and why's that?" Emily held his gaze, her eyes steady and unflinching. "Because you have no idea who you're dealing with." Emily's fingers tightened around her glass, the cool surface grounding her as she glanced briefly at the man towering over her. His shadow stretched across her table, an uninvited guest that demanded her attention. She didn't flinch, though her annoyance flickered briefly in her steady gaze. "I'm fine right here," she replied, her tone calm yet firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. But the biker wasn't one to take hints. His smirk widened, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mock charm. "Don't be like that. You're too pretty to be sitting here all alone." From across the room, his companions hollered in drunken encouragement, their laughter ricocheting off the walls. The tension in the bar grew thicker, the air almost humming with unspoken unease. The bartender, standing stiffly behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers trembled slightly as he wiped a glass, his eyes darting toward Emily. He opened his mouth as if to say something but thought better of it, retreating into the safety of silence. Emily exhaled slowly, her fingers still wrapped tightly around her drink. She wasn't here to pick a fight. She had seen more than her fair share of conflict in her time. But she could feel the eyes of the room on her now, a collective anticipation that she couldn't ignore. "I'm just having a quiet drink," she repeated, her voice steady and even. The biker chuckled, leaning in closer until the smell of stale cigarettes and whiskey became unbearable. "Quiet," he said mockingly. "What's the fun in that?" His buddies erupted in laughter again, their voices filling the small bar like a storm cloud. Another one, thinner and younger but no less obnoxious, stood and joined him. "Don't be rude, missy," he said, his grin as wide as his friend's. "Deke here's just trying to be friendly." Friendly? Emily nearly laughed at the irony of the word. She didn't need to glance around to know the other patrons were doing their best to shrink into the shadows. She'd seen the scene play out too many times before, a group of men, high on bravado, testing the limits of their power just because they could. Emily shifted her gaze to the bartender, who caught her eye for the briefest of moments. His face was pale, and there was a silent plea in his expression. She understood. He didn't want trouble in his bar, but he also wasn't in a position to stop it. Deke slapped a hand down on the edge of her table, the loud crack making the glasses on nearby tables rattle. "Now listen here, sweetheart," he said, his tone hardening. "When someone like me offers you a drink, you say thank you." Emily's patience, already stretched thin, was beginning to fray. She let out a slow breath, her body instinctively relaxing into a readiness she hadn't needed to call upon in months. Her time in the service had trained her for moments like this when control was the difference between escalation and resolution. "I didn't ask for a drink," she said, her tone still calm but with a sharper edge. The room seemed to freeze, the low murmur of other conversations fading entirely. Even the clink of bottles stopped as the bartender hesitated mid-pour. Deke stared at her, his smirk turning into something colder, meaner. He straightened, towering over her. "You've got a real attitude problem, you know that," he said. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And you've got a listening problem." For a moment, the bar was completely silent. Then one of the other bikers burst out laughing, slapping his thigh as he hollered, "She got you good, Deke." Dek's face turned red, a dangerous mix of embarrassment and anger simmering beneath the surface. He grabbed the back of the chair across from her and yanked it out, dropping into it with a thud. "All right, sweetheart," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Let's see how tough you really are." Emily didn't move. She didn't need to. Her calm gaze stayed locked on his, unflinching. "You don't want to do this," she said quietly, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Deke leaned closer, his chair creaking under his weight. "Oh, I think I do." The bartender cleared his throat, stepping out from behind the bar. "Hey, let's keep it civil," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "No need for any trouble here." Deke turned his glare on the bartender, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then he smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Relax, old man," he said, waving him off. "We're just having a conversation." Emily's fingers flexed subtly, her instincts on high alert. She didn't want to start something, but she knew how quickly things could spiral. The younger biker who had joined them pulled up another chair, straddling it backward. "You know," he said, grinning at Emily, "Dek's not so bad once you get to know him. Why don't you give him a chance?" Emily's patience was wearing thin. She straightened slightly, setting her glass down with deliberate precision. "I've made my position clear," she said, her tone colder now. The grin on the younger biker's face faltered, but he recovered quickly. "You've got a real sharp tongue for someone sitting all alone," he said. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she let her silence speak for her, the weight of her gaze enough to unsettle even the boldest of men. Dek's smirk twisted into a sneer. "You think you're better than us?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I think I'm done with this conversation," Emily said, her voice steady. She stood slowly, her movements measured and deliberate. The room tensed as she pushed her chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor cutting through the silence. But Deke wasn't ready to let her go. He grabbed her wrist, his grip rough and unyielding. "Where do you think you're going?" he growled. Emily's eyes dropped to his hand, then back up to his face. Her expression didn't change, but there was a dangerous glint in her eyes now, a warning he was too arrogant to heed. "I'm going to give you one chance to let go," she said quietly, her voice like a blade. The bar held its collective breath. Even the other bikers seemed unsure of what would happen next. Deke tightened his grip, leaning closer. "And what if I don't?" he challenged, his voice full of mock bravado. Emily didn't hesitate. In a single fluid motion, she twisted her wrist, breaking free of his hold and pinning his arm to the table with a force that made the wood groan. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped back, glasses clinked, and the other bikers surged forward, but Emily was already on her feet, her stance firm and unyielding. "Enough," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Her tone, her presence, everything about her commanded attention. The bikers froze, their momentum halted by the sheer force of her authority. Deke stared up at her, his expression a mix of shock and anger. But beneath that, there was something else, something that looked an awful lot like fear. Emily released his arm, stepping back with the same deliberate calm she'd maintained all night. "Walk away," she said, her voice low but firm. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, slowly, Deke pushed himself up from the table, his glare burning into her. "This ain't over," he muttered, his voice full of venom. Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her message was clear, and everyone in the bar knew it. As the bikers retreated to their corner, grumbling among themselves, the bartender let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. Emily sat back down, her movements as calm and composed as ever. She picked up her glass, taking a slow sip as though nothing had happened. The bar began to buzz again, the tension gradually fading. But the air still crackled with the unspoken realization, Emily Dawson was no ordinary woman. And whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. As the bikers retreated to their corner, muttering to themselves and casting occasional glares in Emily's direction, the bar slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though quieter now, as though everyone was still processing what they had just witnessed. The bartender gave Emily a small nod of gratitude before busying himself with a group of patrons who had just walked in. Emily, for her part, appeared unfazed. She sat back in her chair, her demeanor calm, and resumed nursing her drink. She wasn't here to pick fights, and she wasn't one to dwell on unnecessary conflicts. Yet, she could feel the weight of eyes on her, some curious, some wary, and a few, like the biker's stares, filled with simmering resentment. At the corner table, Deke rubbed his wrist where Emily had pinned it moments earlier. His face was a mix of anger and embarrassment, the laughter of his own friends still ringing in his ears. "You just gonna let her get away with that?" one of the bikers, a lanky man with a greasy ponytail, whispered harshly. "She's just some uppity chick who got lucky," another chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. "Ain't no way she pulls a stunt like that again." Dek's jaw tightened, the bruised ego fueling his need for revenge. "She doesn't know who she's messing with," he growled, slamming his empty bottle on the table. "Maybe we remind her," the younger biker suggested with a sly grin, leaning in conspiratorially. The suggestion hung in the air between them, the tension thickening once more. They weren't used to being shown up, least of all by someone they underestimated from the start. But Emily had already sensed their intentions. Years of training in the field had honed her instincts to a razor-sharp edge. Even while she appeared relaxed, her senses were on high alert. She could hear the low murmurs from their corner, feel the charged energy in their stares, and knew it was only a matter of time before they tried something. Across the bar, the bartender watched nervously. He could see where this was heading, and he didn't like it. He walked over to Emily, clearing his throat awkwardly. Miss," he began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe it's best if you head out. Those guys, they don't take kindly to, being put in their place." Emily looked up at him, her expression softening. She appreciated his concern, even if it was misplaced. "Thanks," she said simply, "but I'm fine." The bartender frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Look, I've seen this kind of thing before. They're not gonna let this go. It's not worth it." Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry about me," she said, her tone gentle but resolute. Before the bartender could argue further, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor drew their attention. Deke had stood up, his large frame cutting an imposing figure as he stalked toward Emily's table. His buddies followed closely behind, their expressions ranging from smug to menacing. The bartender backed away quickly, his face pale. Emily, however, didn't move. She remained seated, her calm demeanor unchanged, as though the approaching threat didn't concern her in the slightest. Deke stopped a few feet from her table, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. Emily looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I think I've made it clear I'm not looking for trouble," she said evenly. "Too late for that," Deke replied, his tone dripping with malice. "You embarrassed me in front of my friends, and nobody does that without paying for it." The other bikers snickered behind him, egging him on. The room fell silent again, the other patrons frozen in place as they watched the confrontation unfold. Emily sighed softly, setting her glass down. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Oh yeah?" Deke shot back, stepping closer. "And what are you gonna do about it?" The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the scene playing out before them. Emily stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't tower over Deke, nor did she attempt to match his aggressive posture. Instead, she met his glare with a calm, unwavering stare that seemed to cut right through him. "I've tried to be polite," she said, her voice carrying an edge now. "I've tried to give you a chance to walk away. But if you insist on pushing this, you're not going to like the outcome." Her words hung in the air, their quiet certainty more unsettling than any shout could have been. For a moment, Deke hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But his pride, wounded and fragile, wouldn't allow him to back down. "Big talk for someone who's all alone," he sneered. "Let's see if you can back it up." Before anyone could react, Deke lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. But Emily was ready. In a blur of motion, she sidestepped his grasp, twisting his arm behind his back in one swift, practiced move. Deke let out a strangled yell, the pain evident in his voice. The bar erupted in gasps and murmurs as Emily tightened her hold, keeping him immobilized. "I warned you," she said quietly, her voice carrying an almost chilling calm. The other bikers surged forward, but Emily's sharp gaze stopped them in their tracks. "Unless you want to end up like him," she said, her tone icy, "I suggest you stay where you are." The threat, delivered with such quiet confidence, was enough to give them pause. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado wavering in the face of the unexpected. Emily released Deke, pushing him away with just enough force to make him stumble. He turned to glare at her, his face red with a mix of anger and humiliation, but he didn't make another move. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice shaking. Emily's expression didn't change. "It is if you're smart," she replied simply. Dek's friends hesitated for a moment longer before muttering curses under their breath and retreating to their corner. The bar slowly came back to life, though the tension lingered in the air like a storm that had only just passed. Emily sat back down, her demeanor as composed as ever. She picked up her glass, taking a slow sip as though nothing had happened. But she knew better than to let her guard down. This wasn't over, not yet. The biker who had grabbed Emily's wrist nursed his hand, glaring at her with a mixture of shock and rage. His friends were on their feet now, their faces hardening with a mix of indignation and bravado. The bar's atmosphere, already heavy with unease, seemed to shift into something more volatile. "You made a big mistake, lady," one of the bikers hissed, his voice dripping with menace. He was younger than the others, his leather vest adorned with patches that boasted loyalty to their crew. Emily's calm demeanor didn't waver. She remained steady, her gaze moving from one biker to the next, assessing them with a precision that only years of experience could provide. "If you're smart, you'll all sit back down and finish your drinks," she said, her voice even, almost conversational. The younger biker took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You think you scare us?" he spat. "I'm not here to scare anyone," Emily replied, her tone unyielding. "I'm here to have a quiet drink. It's you who decided to make a scene." The leader of the group, Deke, held up a hand, stopping the younger man from advancing further. His expression was cold, calculating, as he sized Emily up. "You're awful confident for someone all by herself," he said slowly. "What makes you think we won't teach you a lesson right here and now?" Emily allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Because I don't think you want to find out what happens if you try." A ripple of murmurs moved through the other patrons, their curiosity and apprehension palpable. The bikers, however, took her words as a challenge. Deke sneered. "Big words. But you don't look like much to me." One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, added, "Yeah, maybe she got lucky with that little wrist trick. Won't be so lucky next time." Emily's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of steely resolve. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she said simply. The tension in the bar was unbearable now. The bartender, his hands trembling, edged closer to the phone behind the counter, ready to call for help if things escalated further. Deke leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You don't know who you're messing with, lady." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "Neither do you." For a moment, it seemed as though Deke would lash out, but then he stepped back, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "We'll see about that," he said ominously, retreating to their table. The bikers sat down, but their hostile glares remained fixed on Emily. They whispered among themselves, their heads huddled together in conspiring tones. Emily didn't need to hear the words to know they were plotting something. She returned to her seat, but her body remained tense. Her training had taught her to always be ready, to expect the unexpected, and she knew better than to underestimate anyone, even this ragtag group of troublemakers. The bartender approached her hesitantly, his face pale. "Miss, maybe it's best if you leave," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the low hum of conversation. "They're not gonna let this go." Emily glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I'll handle it." The bartender hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, retreating back behind the counter. Emily's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail: the exits, the spacing of the tables, the positioning of the bikers. It was a habit ingrained in her by years of serving in unpredictable and dangerous environments. Meanwhile, at the bikers' table, the tension was simmering. Deke slammed his hand on the table, silencing the muttered complaints of his friends. "I don't care who she thinks she is," he growled. "No one shows us up like that." "She's gotta pay," the scarred man agreed. Deke nodded. "She'll pay. But not here. We'll wait until she leaves, follow her. She can't pull any of her tough act outside the bar." The group nodded in agreement, their eyes flicking toward Emily, who sat calmly at her table. As the minutes ticked by, Emily pretended to relax, but her mind was racing. She caught glimpses of the bikers' furtive glances and subtle gestures, confirming her suspicions. They weren't going to let this go. Her instincts urged her to leave, but she knew she couldn't afford to appear as though she were running. She took another slow sip of her drink, her eyes scanning the room for anyone who might pose an unexpected threat. The other patrons seemed eager to avoid the brewing conflict, their conversations deliberately avoiding the bikers or Emily. A few, however, watched her with a mix of curiosity and admiration, recognizing that there was more to her than met the eye. The bikers grew restless as Emily remained seated, seemingly unbothered by their presence. Dek's patience wore thin. "She's not leaving," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "Maybe she's waiting for backup," the younger biker suggested, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Deke shook his head. "No. She's alone. And she'll regret it." As the clock ticked closer to closing time, Emily finally stood, placing a few bills on the table to cover her drink. The movement caught the attention of the bikers, who straightened in their seats, their eyes narrowing in anticipation. Emily didn't acknowledge them as she walked toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as she reached the exit, the door swinging shut behind her with a faint creak. The bikers exchanged quick glances before standing as one. "Let's go," Deke commanded, leading the way out into the cool night air. Emily's shadow was visible under the flickering street lamp at the end of the parking lot. She walked slowly, her hands in her jacket pockets, as though she were unaware of the figures moving toward her. But Emily was acutely aware. Every step she took was purposeful, leading them exactly where she wanted. The bikers fanned out behind her, their boots crunching against the gravel. Deke called out, his voice filled with false bravado. "Hey, sweetheart. Leaving without saying goodbye?" Emily stopped but didn't turn around. Instead, she spoke over her shoulder, her voice carrying easily in the quiet night. "You really don't want to do this?" The bikers laughed, the sound echoing in the empty lot. "Oh, we do," Deke said, his grin wide. "You've got a lesson coming." Emily finally turned to face them, her expression calm but resolute. The street lamp cast long shadows, illuminating the quiet determination in her eyes. "Last chance," she said, her voice low but firm. Deke smirked. "You think you're scary?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her stance shifting ever so subtly. "No," she said simply. "But you'll wish I was." The bikers hesitated for a fraction of a second, but pride and anger propelled them forward. Emily didn't move, waiting until they were close enough. What happened next was a blur of precision and control. In the span of seconds, Emily disarmed and disabled the first two bikers with swift, calculated movements that left them gasping on the ground. The others hesitated, their confidence faltering as they realized the depth of their mistake. One by one, they tried to overpower her, only to be met with the kind of skill and training that none of them could match. Emily's movements were fluid, her strikes efficient, each one landing with pinpoint accuracy. When the dust settled, the bikers lay scattered across the lot, groaning in pain. Emily stood in the center, her breathing steady, her stance unwavering. Deke, clutching his ribs, stared up at her in disbelief. What are you?" he gasped. Emily looked down at him, her expression impassive. "Someone you should have left alone." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the bikers to grapple with the consequences of their arrogance. Emily moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen far worse than this. The bikers groaned and cursed, trying to regain their footing, but every attempt to confront her ended in swift failure. Deke, stubborn despite his injuries, dragged himself to his knees. "You think this is over," he spat, his voice laced with pain and defiance. "We'll find you. We'll make you pay." Emily didn't stop walking, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the street lamp as she headed toward her motorcycle parked near the edge of the lot. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the seat. Without turning around, she spoke, her voice carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Deke, isn't it?" The biker froze, startled that she knew his name. His companions, still sprawled across the ground, exchanged nervous glances. "You talk big," Emily continued, her tone steady but edged with steel. "But this isn't about you or me anymore. This is about the choices you make next. Walk away, and you might just keep whatever dignity you've got left." Deke clenched his fists, fury and humiliation warring on his face. He opened his mouth to retort, but the look in Emily's eyes silenced him. It wasn't anger or hatred that he saw, it was something far more unsettling: absolute control. She wasn't scared. She wasn't rattled. She was in complete command, and he knew it. The other bikers began to stir, their groans growing louder as they nursed their bruises. One of them, the younger man who had tried to act tough earlier, crawled toward Deke, his voice trembling. "Boss, let's just go. She's not like anyone we've dealt with before." Deke shot him a glare but didn't argue. He struggled to his feet, glaring at Emily's back as if trying to burn a hole through her resolve. But even in his anger, he knew the truth: she wasn't bluffing. Whatever she had been through, whatever had honed her into this force of nature, it had left her prepared for men like him. "Get up," Deke barked at his crew, his voice tinged with frustration. "We're leaving." The other bikers hesitated, casting wary glances at Emily before slowly hauling themselves to their feet. One of them muttered something under his breath, but no one dared to voice their complaints too loudly. As they retreated toward their bikes, Deke threw one last glance over his shoulder. "You think you've won," he snarled. "This isn't the end." Emily finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "It is if you're smart." Deke didn't respond. He swung his leg over his bike and revved the engine, the roar echoing in the still night air. One by one, the other bikers followed suit, their battered pride fueling their hasty exit. When the rumble of engines faded into the distance, Emily exhaled quietly, her posture relaxing ever so slightly. She glanced around the lot, ensuring that the bikers were truly gone, then returned to her motorcycle. The door to the bar creaked open, and the bartender stepped out cautiously, his face pale but relieved. "You okay?" he asked hesitantly. Emily nodded. "Yeah." The bartender shook his head in disbelief. "I've seen those guys mess up a lot of people, but you took them down like it was nothing. Who are you?" Emily didn't answer right away. She adjusted her gloves, her movements deliberate. Finally, she said, "Just someone who doesn't like bullies." The bartender gave a nervous chuckle. "Well, I think they got the message. You've got a way of making people rethink their choices." Emily swung a leg over her bike, the engine roaring to life as she kick-started it. "Let's hope so," she said. Then, with a final nod to the bartender, she sped off into the night, leaving the small roadside bar behind. The ride was smooth, the cool night air rushing past her as she navigated the empty highway. But Emily's mind wasn't at ease. She knew men like Deke didn't just let things go. Their pride wouldn't allow it. The question wasn't if they'd come after her again, it was when. She had encountered their type before, men who thrived on intimidation and control, feeding off the fear of others. They rarely learned their lessons the first time. That didn't bother Emily. She wasn't afraid of them. She just hoped they'd think twice before dragging others into their vendetta. The moonlight illuminated the winding road ahead, casting long shadows that danced across the asphalt. Emily tightened her grip on the handlebars, her thoughts drifting back to her time in the military. The discipline, the training, the countless nights spent preparing for scenarios just like tonight, it had all shaped her into the person she was now. And though she had left that life behind, the instincts never truly faded. Meanwhile, miles away, Deke and his crew regrouped at a secluded spot off the main road. The air was thick with tension as the bikers tended to their injuries, their bruised egos more painful than their battered bodies. "Who the hell is she?" one of them muttered, rubbing his jaw where Emily had landed a particularly well-placed strike. Deke didn't answer right away. He paced back and forth, his face twisted in a mix of anger and frustration. "She's nobody," he finally growled. "Just some wannabe tough girl who got lucky." "Lucky?" the younger biker scoffed. "She took all of us down, Deke. That wasn't luck." Deke stopped pacing, his glare silencing the younger man. "We're not letting her get away with this," he said firmly. "No one embarrasses us like that." The scarred biker, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "Maybe we should let it go. She's not normal, Deke. She knew what she was doing. If we push this, we might regret it." Deke's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to back down. "We're not letting it go," he snapped. "She thinks she's untouchable? Fine. We'll show her she's not." Unbeknownst to Deke and his crew, Emily had already anticipated their next move. As she pulled into a quiet motel for the night, she kept her senses sharp, her eyes scanning the parking lot for anything out of place. She didn't expect them to come immediately, they'd need time to regroup and plan. But she knew they'd come eventually. Inside her room, she set her bag down and began methodically checking her gear. Her time in the service had taught her the value of preparedness. She wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came her way, she wouldn't hesitate to end it. Her mind replayed the encounter at the bar, analyzing every detail. It wasn't the first time she'd faced aggression from men who underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this group felt different. They were reckless, yes, but also dangerous in their stubbornness. People like that didn't back down easily. As she sat on the edge of the bed, Emily allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The road she had chosen since leaving the military was far from easy. She had seen too much, done too much to ever truly feel at peace. But if her skills could make a difference, even in small, unexpected ways, then maybe it was worth it. Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying with it the promise of another long night. Emily leaned back, her hand resting on the duffel bag beside her. She was ready. Whatever came next, she'd be ready. The leader's sneer faltered, his confidence shaken. He reached for the ID cautiously, holding it as if it might burn him. His eyes scanned the details, lingering on the insignia that confirmed her elite status. "Special Forces," he muttered under his breath. "No way." Emily crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "You picked the wrong person to mess with tonight," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind it left no room for argument. For a long moment, no one moved. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado reduced to nervous shuffling. One of the younger ones, a wiry man with a patchy beard, finally broke the silence. "Deke, we can't take her. Not after what she just did back there." Deke, the leader, slammed the ID onto the table and glared at his crew. "You scared of her?" he barked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's just one person." "Yeah," another biker muttered, rubbing his bruised arm, "but she's not just anyone, is she?" Deke's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to admit defeat. "We've got numbers," he growled. "She can't take all of us." Emily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're welcome to try," she said, her tone almost taunting. "But if you think numbers will save you, then you don't understand the first thing about what I've been trained to do." The bikers hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. Emily wasn't bluffing, and deep down, they all knew it. She had moved with precision earlier, her actions deliberate and efficient. This wasn't someone who fought on instinct alone. She was trained, disciplined, and dangerous. Deke wasn't ready to let it go. "You think you're better than us because you've got a badge and some fancy training," he snarled, stepping forward. "Out here, that doesn't mean squat." Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Out here, all that matters is knowing how to survive," she said evenly. "And I've survived things you can't even imagine." The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Dekka's hand twitched toward his waistband, where a knife was sheathed. Emily noticed, her sharp eyes catching the subtle movement. "Don't," she said softly but firmly, her tone carrying a warning. Deke froze, his hand hovering above the knife. He hesitated, the weight of her gaze rooting him in place. It was as if she could see every thought running through his mind, dissecting his intentions before he could act on them. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on the standoff. Finally, Deke cursed under his breath and stepped back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Emily turned her attention to the rest of the group. "You can walk away now," she said, her voice carrying an air of finality. "But if you push this any further, I promise you'll regret it." One by one, the bikers began to retreat, their earlier arrogance replaced with caution. Even Deke, though reluctant, seemed to sense that continuing this fight would only end badly for him. He glared at Emily, his expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. Emily raised an eyebrow. "It is if you're smart," she replied. "But if you want to find out the hard way, I'll be ready." Deke didn't respond. He turned and stalked out of the bar, his crew following closely behind. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the room eerily quiet. The bartender, who had been frozen in place during the confrontation, finally exhaled. "You just faced down Deke and his crew," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I've seen them run people out of town for less." Emily shrugged and retrieved her ID from the table. "They're bullies," she said simply. "And bullies don't like it when someone stands up to them." The bartender shook his head in disbelief. "I've been running this place for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone handle them like that." "Who are you, really?" Emily slipped the ID back into her jacket and gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Just someone who doesn't like trouble." As she walked toward the exit, the patrons who had been silently watching began to murmur among themselves. Some offered quiet nods of gratitude, others simply stared, still trying to process what had just happened. Outside, the night was calm again, the earlier chaos feeling like a distant memory. Emily climbed onto her motorcycle, the engine rumbling to life beneath her. She glanced back at the bar, her eyes lingering on the door for a moment. She knew Dekka's parting words weren't empty. Men like him didn't let things go easily. But Emily wasn't worried. She had faced far worse in her life, and if they came after her again, she would be ready. With a final glance at the quiet roadside bar, she pulled out onto the highway and disappeared into the night, the faint glow of her tail lights the only trace she had ever been there. The distant hum of Emily's motorcycle grew softer, swallowed by the dark expanse of the open highway. Back at the bar, the tension lingered like a heavy fog. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, recounting the events as if they'd witnessed something extraordinary, something that demanded to be remembered. Dekka's crew gathered a few miles down the road, where the faint glow of a campfire flickered against the shadows of the surrounding trees. They sat in a loose circle, their wounds and egos still fresh. Deke paced the perimeter, his mind racing with anger and embarrassment. She humiliated us, he spat, kicking at a loose stone. In front of everyone. The younger biker, still nursing a swollen cheek, hesitated before speaking. Maybe we should let it go, Deke. She's not like the others we've dealt with. Deke spun on his heel, his eyes blazing. Let it go? After what she did? You think people won't hear about this? About how we got taken down by one woman? The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words sinking in. Reputation was everything to them, and tonight's defeat had left a deep scar. One of the older bikers, a man with a weathered face and a deep scar running across his jaw, finally spoke. She's military, he said, his voice steady. Not just some grunt, either. Special forces. We go after her again, and we're asking for trouble. Dek's pride bristled. So what? She's still just one person. She's one person who took all of us down without breaking a sweat, the scarred man countered. Think about that, Deke. She's not someone we want to mess with. Deke growled in frustration, his fists clenching. He hated the truth in the man's words, but his pride refused to back down. He couldn't let this go, not without reasserting his dominance. We'll see about that, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Meanwhile, Emily rode on, the rhythmic thrum of her motorcycle a soothing constant against the backdrop of her thoughts. She had encountered men like Deke before, men who mistook arrogance for strength, who saw the world as something to dominate rather than understand. They were predictable, driven by their own insecurities and the need to prove themselves. She knew Deke wouldn't let this go. His type never did. But she wasn't afraid. If anything, she welcomed the challenge. It had been a long time since she felt truly tested, and tonight had awakened something dormant within her, a readiness, a purpose. As the miles stretched behind her, Emily found herself reflecting on her past. The training, the missions, the nights spent in hostile territories, it had all shaped her, forging her into someone who thrived under pressure. Civilians didn't always understand the burden of that life, the weight of decisions that could mean life or death. But it was those experiences that had prepared her for moments like tonight. When Emily finally stopped at a small roadside motel, the air was cool and still. She parked her bike and checked in with little fanfare, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, barely glanced up from his desk. Room 12, he said, sliding a key across the counter. End of the hall. Emily nodded her thanks and headed toward her room. Once inside, she locked the door and surveyed her surroundings. It was basic: bed, chair, small table, but it served its purpose. She set her bag down and began unpacking, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Among her belongings was a small, weathered notebook. She opened it to a blank page and began jotting down notes, capturing details from the night while they were still fresh in her mind. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Every encounter was a potential lesson, every challenge an opportunity to sharpen her instincts. Back at the campfire, Deke finally stopped pacing. He turned to his crew, his expression hard. "We're not letting her get away with this," he declared. "We're going after her." The younger biker shifted uncomfortably. "Deke, maybe we should think this through." She. "Enough." Deke snapped, his voice echoing through the trees. "If any of you want to back out, fine. But I'm not letting her make a fool of us." The scarred man sighed, his face weary. "You're walking into a fight you can't win, Deke." "We'll see about that," Deke retorted. He pointed to the younger biker. "You said you saw the plate on her bike, right?" The man nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, but..." "Good. Then we've got a place to start." Emily had just settled onto the bed, her body relaxed but her mind alert, when her phone buzzed. It was a text from a former teammate, Someone she trusted. Heard you had a run-in tonight. Everything okay? Emily smirked, her fingers tapping out a quick reply. Nothing I couldn't handle. Just some local troublemakers. The response came almost immediately. Be careful. Word travels fast, and guys like that don't take kindly to being shown up. I know, Emily replied. I'm ready for them. She set the phone aside and leaned back, her thoughts drifting. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she wouldn't shy away from it, either. If Deke and his crew came after her again, she'd be waiting. The room remained quiet for a moment, the tension of the confrontation slowly dissolving into a mix of relief and awe. The bikers had left, their retreat a humbling defeat that no one in the bar would forget anytime soon. Emily sat back down at her table, her presence still commanding the attention of everyone around her. The bartender, shaking off his nervousness, leaned over the counter, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. That was something else, he said, his voice filled with both respect and disbelief. I've been working this bar for over 20 years, and I've never seen anyone take Deke and his crew down like that. You sure know how to handle yourself. Emily gave him a small nod, her demeanor still calm and composed. It's just about standing your ground when it counts, she said, her tone casual but with a firmness that made it clear she wasn't someone to be messed with. The other patrons, who had been quiet during the standoff, slowly started to gather around. They had witnessed the entire exchange, and their gazes followed Emily with a mix of curiosity and admiration. A few of the older men, who had likely seen their share of rough characters in the past, nodded to her in silent respect. One of them, a burly man with a thick gray beard, stepped forward. You handled that better than I would have, no doubt about it, he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Those guys usually don't back down, but you made em think twice. Emily didn't respond immediately, her eyes meeting his for a moment before looking back down at her drink. Sometimes you have to make them realize they picked the wrong person. The bartender placed a fresh drink in front of Emily, the glass a simple whiskey with a few ice cubes. That one's on the house, he said, his voice warm with appreciation. You've earned it. Emily gave a small smile, raising the glass slightly in acknowledgement before taking a slow sip. The drink was smooth, the warmth of the alcohol soothing in contrast to the adrenaline that still hummed beneath her skin. The room began to return to its usual rhythm. The tension had dissipated, but the mood had shifted. The people who had been too afraid to speak up earlier now seemed more at ease, emboldened by the fact that someone had stood up to the bikers. It was as though Emily's actions had given them the courage to relax, to let go of the fear that had gripped the bar just moments before. As the minutes passed, more people began to approach Emily. They weren't overly loud or boisterous, their approach was quiet, respectful. It was clear that they were grateful, not just for the way she had handled the bikers, but for the fact that she had made them feel safe in a place that had previously felt like a den of intimidation. A young woman, probably in her 20s, hesitated before speaking up. I've never seen anything like that, she said, her voice soft but filled with wonder. You just took control of the whole room. It was like you were in charge the whole time. Emily looked at her, her expression softening just a little. It's not about being in charge, she replied. It's about making sure people know they don't have to live in fear. The young woman nodded slowly, as if she were processing the weight of those words. She smiled then, a genuine, grateful smile. Thank you, she said. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. Emily didn't need to respond. She simply gave a slight nod, acknowledging the sentiment. She wasn't one for drawing attention to herself, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that her actions had made a difference. Not just in that moment, but in the lives of the people in that room. The conversation shifted after that. The patrons began to share stories of other run-ins they'd had with rough customers, with a new sense of camaraderie between them. For a brief moment, it was as if the entire bar had been transformed. What had been a place of tension and unease was now filled with laughter and conversation, the atmosphere lighter, freer. Emily stayed for a while longer, nursing her drink as she listened to the chatter around her. The bar felt different now, less like a place to escape from the world and more like a place to reconnect with it. The patrons no longer viewed her as just a stranger passing through, they saw her as someone who had helped them, someone who had stood up when no one else would. As the night wore on, the conversations grew quieter, the patrons slowly heading toward the door as the hour grew late. Emily had no intention of staying long, but she had no rush either. She took her time, finishing her drink and surveying the bar one last time. The bartender wiped down the counter, occasionally glancing up at her with a silent nod of respect. When the last of the patrons had filtered out, the bartender gave her a final look. "You're welcome to come back anytime," he said. "We could use more people like you around here." Emily stood up, placing a few bills on the counter to cover her drink. She gave the bartender a nod of acknowledgement. "Thanks," she said simply, turning to leave. As she walked out the door and into the cool night air, she felt the familiar hum of her motorcycle beneath her. The world outside was still and quiet, but for Emily, it was never truly quiet. There was always something on the horizon, always another challenge waiting to be faced. She climbed onto her bike and started the engine, the low rumble filling the air. She glanced back at the bar one last time, her eyes lingering on the faded neon sign. It wasn't much, but it had been her refuge for the night. And in a way, she had given it something back, too. With a twist of the throttle, she pulled away, the sound of the engine growing fainter as she disappeared into the darkness. The night was hers to own, and nothing, not even a group of reckless bikers, could take that from her. The quiet hum of the bar filled the air again, the soft murmur of conversations blending with the clink of glasses and the low sound of a jukebox playing in the corner. Emily sat back down, her body relaxed, though her mind was still sharp. She picked up her glass once more, taking a slow sip. The whiskey burned as it slid down her throat, a simple pleasure after the tension of the evening. Her eyes scanned the room, watching the patrons as they slowly returned to their own conversations, no longer eyeing her with uncertainty but with a kind of respect that felt almost unfamiliar. She wasn't looking for recognition, nor did she expect anyone to heap praise on her for what had just happened. She'd acted out of instinct, as much to protect herself as to protect the other people in the room. In the end, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about ensuring that the night ended without further escalation. The bikers had been dealt with, and with that, the tension that had previously gripped the room had melted away. Everyone could breathe a little easier. For Emily, it was just another moment in a long series of them. Moments where she had to stand her ground, moments when she was forced to remind others sometimes harshly that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. She had learned a long time ago that the world often didn't make room for the quiet ones, the ones who preferred to avoid conflict rather than seek it out. And yet, she knew, the quiet ones could be the most dangerous of all. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze turning thoughtful. Sometimes, the strongest people weren't the ones who were loud, the ones who wore their strength like armor for everyone to see. The strongest people were often the ones who carried their power quietly, who knew when to stand back and when to act. They weren't seeking a fight, but they were always ready when one came knocking. Emily had learned that over the years. Growing up in a world where she had to fight for respect, fight for a place in a system that often overlooked her, had shaped her into someone who understood the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment. It wasn't about starting fights or picking battles, it was about knowing how to handle yourself when the fight found you. She wasn't proud of the confrontations she had faced over the years. They were simply a part of life, a part of the life she had chosen. But she knew that each one had shaped her, honed her abilities, and prepared her for whatever came next. In her quiet moments, When she allowed herself to reflect on her past, she often found herself thinking about the people who had underestimated her. The ones who thought she was too small, too soft, or too quiet to make a difference. Those people, she realized, had always been the ones who never saw it coming. They didn't understand that the quietest person in the room could often be the one with the most to lose and, therefore, the most to fight for. They thought her calmness was weakness, but in truth, it was her strength. The ability to stay calm in the face of danger, to assess and then act with precision, was what had kept her alive all these years. And now, here she was again sitting in a bar that had been shaken by the presence of a group of bikers who had underestimated her. They thought they could push her around, that she was just another easy target. But they had been wrong. She had proven, once again, that strength didn't always announce itself with loud actions or angry words. Sometimes, it was quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. As she sat there, her mind wandered to the people in the room who had watched her, who had seen the exchange with the bikers unfold. They would leave the bar tonight with a story to tell, a story that would spread through the town. The story of the quiet woman who had taken on the bikers and shown them, in no uncertain terms, that there was power in silence. Power in composure. Power in standing your ground when everyone else might back down. It was a story they would remember. But Emily wasn't concerned with making stories. She wasn't interested in becoming a legend or being known for any particular act of bravery. For her, it wasn't about glory. It was about the quiet sense of satisfaction that came from doing what was right, regardless of the outcome. It was about knowing that she had faced a challenge and handled it in a way that felt true to who she was. It was about the peace of mind that came from knowing she could stand her ground, even when the odds were against her. And as the minutes ticked by and the bar began to quiet down, Emily couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about showing up, about facing whatever came her way, and handling it with the calm confidence of someone who knew that she was in control of her own fate. When people looked at her, they might have seen someone small and unassuming, someone who didn't seem to fit the typical mold of someone who would stand up to a group of rough bikers. But those who underestimated her had always been the ones who ended up regretting it. She finished her drink and stood up, placing a few bills on the counter. The bartender nodded again, his respect for her clear in the way he didn't need to say anything more. He had seen it for himself. As Emily walked toward the door, she felt the cool night air greet her, a gentle breeze stirring her hair. The sound of the motorcycle's engine roared to life as she swung her leg over the seat. It was a simple moment, but it was hers. The road stretched out before her, dark and endless. But in that moment, Emily didn't feel alone. She felt a deep connection to the world around her, to the people who had witnessed her stand up for what was right. She felt, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't just passing through. She was part of something, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. And in that moment, she knew she had made a difference. With a twist of the throttle, she drove off into the night, her figure fading into the darkness. The night held endless possibilities, but Emily wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She knew that whatever challenges she faced, she would face them head-on, just as she always had. And no matter who underestimated her, they would always find out too late that they had picked the wrong person. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who don't seek a fight, but when the fight finds them, they're always ready. They don't need to prove anything to anyone. They just do what's necessary, and they do it with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who they are. And in the end, that's the most powerful thing of all.